With so many car companies abandoning sedans entirely, if you're looking for a mid-size family sedan with a bit more of a performance mission in mind, you don't have too many options. By my count, there are really just four. We have the Camry V6, especially the TRD version, the Accord 2.0T, especially the sport trim, the new Hyundai Sonata N Line, and then the closely related Kia K5 GT. In this video, I'm not going to be talking too much about the Kia K5 because in some ways you could call this really a three-horse race because the K5 and the Sonata are incredibly closely related. You want to get the K5 if you like the way it looks, and you want to get the Sonata if you like the way it looks. They use the same engine, the same transmission, etc. Performance figures are almost identical, and I will have a full review of that K5 coming up in about the next 2 weeks or so. What about the turbocharged options from Nissan, Mazda, and Subaru? Well, I'll talk about why I don't count them in this calculation as we continue this video. When you approach the Sonata, the first thing you're going to notice is this absolutely enormous and somewhat controversial grille. I have to say that I think I like the design of the current generation Honda Accord just a little bit better than this. I think this is just about as controversial as the front end in the Kia K5, and I think that the Toyota Camry's design has grown on me a little bit since it launched. In the N Line, the grille is a little bit different than we find in the rest of the lineup. It still definitely looks pretty hungry and a little bit catfishy. We don't have any fog lights down lower on the bumper, but we do have some functional vents right here. Those help relieve pressure up front and direct it around the front wheel well. And then we have this very distinctive accent light strip that runs from underneath the headlight, then up and over the hood. At the moment, all N-Line Sonatas get unique wheels. This is a 19-inch wheel, and it's wrapped in a unique tire as well. These are 245 width tires, which is one step larger than we find in the Sonata. It's also one step larger than we find in the Camry TRD or the Accord Sport 2.0T. And summer tires are optional. That's an interesting twist as well, and it's a pretty good deal because the summer tire upgrade's only $200. If you're thinking about upgrading to the summer tires, keep in mind that the tread life on these tires is going to be an awful lot lower than the standard tire in the Sonata N, so definitely keep that in mind. In addition to the upgraded wheels and tires, the brakes also get larger, 1.6 inches larger in the front and 1 inch larger in the rear. Dimensionally, most mid-size sedans in America are clustered pretty close together. They're all pretty much between 192 and 193 inches long. This is only fractions of an inch off of the Accord and Camry. On the inside, however, the space is apportioned a little bit differently, with the Accord arguably being perhaps the most space efficient. We find a little bit more legroom in the Accord than we find in this, and a little bit less legroom in the Camry. Refrigerator white wouldn't be my top color choice for my next new car, but it does help highlight some of the trim differences that we find in the Sonata N Line, like the sills under the front doors and the rear doors, the ducktail spoiler that we have right here on the trunk lid. The trunk lid itself has sort of a ducktail shape to it. It's reminiscent of what we see in the Elantra, but it doesn't quite look as sort of sliced through or karate chopped as we find in that Elantra. We also have this black trim down at the bottom and then distinctive quad exhaust tips in the N Line. Let me know what you think about the lighting in the Sonata. I really like the tail lamp arrangement here. In the top end N Line trim, we do get full LED tail lamp modules instead of the combination tail lamps that we find in the base version. Sadly, however, the turn signals are red. As we look under the hood, you'll notice another distinctive feature about the accent lights up front. They stay with the body, and then the hood is this center section. It doesn't wrap as far around as we see in some of the competition. Under the hood, we find a variant of the 2.5-liter turbocharged engine that's working its way across the Genesis lineup. Only under this hood, it's been rotated 90 degrees to power the front wheels. Power output is a little bit below what we see in the Genesis lineup, 290 horsepower and 311 pound-feet of torque. It's mated only to a brand new 8-speed dual-clutch transmission, which is pretty different than the dual clutches we've seen out of Hyundai before. This transmission has clutches that are swimming in an oil bath. That's why it's a wet dual clutch transmission, and that makes the shifts an awful lot smoother than we see in the 7-speed dry clutch transmission from Hyundai. If you've driven a dry clutch DCT and thought it was just a little bit too herky-jerky, whether it was one of Hyundai's transmissions or one of the Volkswagen transmissions out there, you might want to give this one a try. It feels much more like a traditional automatic transmission in slow and go and stop and go traffic, but it has the quick shifts you'd expect out of a DCT. It also has a pretty aggressive first gear. The effective ratio is 14.8 to 1. But thanks to the DCT and the new engine design, fuel economy is pretty good for such a powerful engine, 27 miles per gallon combined for this particular model. Obviously, there's more to a performance sedan than simply 0 to 60 numbers, but the 0 to 60 times from this vehicle are truly impressive. In my 0 to 60 testing, I ran 0 to 60 in 5.15 seconds. One quick point of clarification. That 0 to 60 time happened with launch control. If you don't use launch control, but you have good traction and you're in Sport Plus in this vehicle, then 0 to 60 was about 5.3 seconds because the front wheel spin wasn't quite as well controlled as it was with launch control. If you're in the regular drive modes, that goes out to a little bit longer, about 5.4 seconds, but that's still going to be faster than the Camry or the Accord, which did it in 5.7 each. Also significantly faster than the Nissan Altima, which generally runs between 5.9 and 6 seconds, depending on which one I've been able to test, the Subaru Legacy at 6.2, and the Mazda 6 at 6.4. At this point, some of you might be quite legitimately scratching your head. How is it that the Sonata N Line is so much faster than the competition, especially something like the Mazda 6, when the Mazda 6 produces actually more torque than this engine? Remember that performance figures depend on more than simply power out of the engine or the top-end torque figure. Traction is an important factor. The Mazda 6 has skinnier tires up front. If it had wider tires, perhaps it would be a little bit faster. If this vehicle had wider tires, it would probably be faster as well. But the way the engine delivers power, and also important, the way the transmission delivers power, is incredibly important as well. The 0 to 60 time in this model is different whether you're using launch control or not using launch control, because launch control helps minimize the wheel hop and wheel spin up front, but it also allows the turbocharger to spool up and deliver you more torque from a stop. Transmissions can make a huge difference, and that's why the Accord, even though it has less horsepower and less torque than this, is really not as far off as you might think, because it has a very, very aggressive first gear ratio of 18.62 to 1, thanks to its 10-speed automatic transmission. However, you will notice that after, say, 50 or 60 miles an hour, the Accord feels like it's running out of steam, and the Sonata Turbo certainly doesn't. What about the CVT-equipped models? Well, the transmission definitely is playing against those. The Nissan Altima, 6.0 to 6.2 seconds, depending on exactly which one I've tested. Not only does it produce less power, 248 horsepower and 273 pound-feet of torque, but it has a 12.7 to 1 starting ratio in its CVT, and the Legacy is pretty similar. The Legacy, even though it produces more power than we find in the Altima, has a 12.6 to 1 ratio in its transmission, and then of course it has the added weight of all-wheel drive, and that's why it goes 0 to 60 in 6.2. You might be wondering, what about the Mazda 6? Well, there are a number of factors there. It has an older 6-speed automatic transmission. It does have a pretty decent first gear ratio, but second gear is not as far off of what we see in the Camry, the Accord, or of course the Sonata. The distance between first and second is further apart. It's a lot closer together in these other vehicles. The 6-speed auto is also pretty heavy. It has relatively skinny tires, and it simply doesn't produce as much horsepower as we find out of this engine. The horsepower and torque curve also appears to be a little bit different. Some folks were asking me over at facebook.com/AlexandAutos, how is it that this matches the old Fusion Sport, which was about 5.3 to 5.2 seconds 0 to 60, when it produced way more power than this, 325 horsepower and 380 pound-feet of torque. Well, same thing I've been talking about. That used an older 6-speed automatic transmission, and something that Ford didn't really like to talk about a lot. It ended up limiting torque in first and second gear. Now, that engine was still producing a great deal of torque, it just wasn't producing it all the time. At least for my body shape, I find front seat comfort, specifically driver's seat comfort, to be very comparable to the top-end versions of the Camry and Accord. A nice touch in the N Line model is that we do have inflatable bolsters for the driver. That definitely is a good thing when you can pull the kind of G's that the Sonata N Line is capable of. We have a manual tilt telescopic steering column, but rather unfortunately, the manual passenger seat is definitely a bummer. In the top-end trims of most of the competition, you'll at least get some range of motion in a powered fashion in the top-end trim. For some reason, the N Line version of the Sonata does not get all of the same features and upgrades that we see in the top-end limited version of the Sonata with the less powerful engine under the hood. When it comes to legroom, we get 80.9 inches of combined legroom in the Sonata. That's just a little bit above the Camry, but about 2 inches behind the Accord. The Accord definitely has a lot of interior length, but rather unfortunately, it has about an inch less headroom than we find in the Sonata. And that means that this rear seat is significantly more comfortable for me, and I suspect significantly more comfortable for most tall folks, because if I put my head back here to the headrest, my head is actually touching the ceiling still in here, and it would definitely be an awful lot less comfortable in that Accord. Like the Accord and the Camry, the rear bench is pretty wide, so this could accommodate 3 adults if you needed to, but like the Camry and Accord, headroom is going to be a little bit limited. Now, this model does have the panoramic moonroof right there. If I scoot all the way over to the right side of the cabin, this front seat's all the way back in its tracks. I still have about 2 inches of legroom left. Behind the trunk lid, we find 16 cubic feet of cargo capacity that puts this almost exactly between the Accord and the Camry. The Accord gets 16.7, the Camry 15.1. In my 24-inch roller bag score, however, all three of these vehicles are essentially identical because of the way that they're shaped. Cargo area here is a little bit deeper than we find in the Camry, but it's not deep enough to put some of those larger roller bags in a vertical position and then put more of them in the cargo area. The 60/40 folding rear seats are controlled via handles back here in the cargo area. And under the load floor, we find a temporary spare tire with what looks like perhaps enough room to put a full-size spare tire yourself aftermarket back here. Now with the 245 with tires on this model, it may be a little bit tall, but you could definitely do that with the base Sonata. The large spare tire definitely helps the Sonata gain points when it comes to my exclusive trunk comfort index, but I am going to have to deduct a few points for no handle to help close the trunk lid on the outside. You're left to just paw on the paint on the outside. Looking around the interior, we have a panoramic moonroof in this model. It's a dual pane variety, and it extends to just about the rear passenger's knee area, not really the rear passenger's heads. As with the rest of the Sonata lineup, we get height-adjustable shoulder belts and height-adjustable headrests. The N Line has unique upholstery. You can see it's a combination of leather and this imitation suede material right there. We have some contrasting red piping and red stitching, and that also applies to the rear seats, but no red seat belts like we find in the Toyota TRD. It's a little bit difficult to film, but we do have ambient lighting in this cabin running from the front door across the dashboard to the other front door. On the doors, it's positioned right below that dark chrome strip that is an accent strip that runs across the door and then turns into the door handle up front. As with the rest of the Sonata lineup, the N Line gets Hyundai's latest key fob, but you'll notice that we don't have any forward or backward buttons on here like we do find in the top-end regular Sonata. That's because you don't get the Smart Park system available in the N Line for some reason. The instrument cluster is a large, full-color LCD that certainly looks more modern than what we see in the Camry and an Accord, but rather unfortunately, it's not as adjustable as the new Elantra, which did strike me as odd. It does have some different looks, so we go to Normal, Sport, and Sport Plus. You can see that we have that Sport gauge look and the Normal or Custom gauge look, but in the Elantra, you can unlink them from the drive mode and select whichever one you prefer. I prefer looking at this one all the time, even when I'm in the Custom drive mode, but that's not an option at this point with the N Line. Also strangely not available is the heads-up display that we do find available in the regular versions of the Sonata. The steering wheel is a comfortable 4-spoke design that's certainly grown on me. While I do prefer the look of a 3-spoke wheel like we do find in some of the competition, I have to say this one is very comfortable with the grips being in good places for my driving style. We have paddle shifters on the back, up on the right, down on the left, and some pretty aggressive sport grips up top. The controls for the standard adaptive cruise control system and highway driving assistant are over here on the right side of the steering wheel, along with controls for that multifunction LCD cluster, and then on the left side of the wheel we find controls for the infotainment system. Back out on the road, there's obviously more to a performance sedan than simply 0 to 60 numbers, and thankfully the Sonata N Line really delivers here as well. In my 60 to 0 braking test, this delivered BMW 3 Series-like stopping distances of 108 feet. You can thank the summer tires for that and the wide tires for that. Now, in my 60 to 0 stopping test, I was surprised because the road was not perfectly dry. It has been pretty wet out here, and the road this morning was not exactly standing water, but it wasn't exactly dry either. Most of the competition will stop in around 120 to 125 feet, with some of the longer distances being vehicles like the Subaru Legacy and the Mazda 6, because those vehicles have relatively narrow tires. The tire size and the choice of the tire size and compound really is interesting in this Sonata N Line. The Camry V6, as long as we're talking about most of the V6 trims, and the Accord 2.0T, they oddly enough have the same tires and same tire size both on those two vehicles. It's a moderately efficient design tire. It's an all-season tire, not a summer tire, and they just don't have the grip that we find out of the Sonata N Line's tires. But even if we're not talking about the optional summer tires, the Sonata N Line does very well, because the chassis, the suspension tuning on this vehicle, and the tire size as well all factor into the way that this vehicle feels out on the road. The steering also has a great feel to it. There's not as much steering feel as we find in the Mazda 6, but it still has a very sorted, very stable feel to it. The best way that I can describe the way this Sonata feels out on the road is Germanic. This honestly feels like a grown-up Volkswagen GTI. This is sort of the Passat that we've never had in America. That shouldn't surprise too many folks, of course, because there are a number of head designers over at Hyundai right now that have come from a number of key German brands. So it really shouldn't surprise anybody that most of Hyundai's recent vehicles have a very Germanic feel to them out on the road, this Sonata N Line included. As you'd expect out of the performance option, the ride quality is definitely firmer in here than we find in the regular Sonata. It's not quite as harsh as some of the performance compact hatches or compact sedans out there, but I have to admit I wish this had an adaptive suspension system. That's something that we find, for instance, in the Toyota Avalon with the V6. 0 to 60 acceleration times aren't going to be too far off this. They're essentially the same as the Toyota Camry. I suspect that the big reason that they chose not to use an adaptive suspension system in this vehicle is that would have caused them to use softer springs and then adjustable dampers. That's typically what manufacturers do when we're talking about vehicles in this price range. And there are definitely some trade-offs to that. It probably wouldn't have had the sharp handling feel that we find in this model, even when it's in its most aggressive setting, because adjusting the damping doesn't always compensate for the spring rate. For some things, you just want firmer springs. That does, however, mean that you will certainly feel a lot of the smaller road imperfections in this cabin than you will in the regular versions of the Sonata. Back out on the paved road, I'm going to give the ride quality a B-, basically the same that we find in the Camry TRD. I think that both Hyundai and Toyota did a good job of sitting on the fence between handling and ride quality. Obviously, this is a family-focused mid-size sedan, room for the kids in the back, room for a lot of cargo, etc. It's a comfortable, large sedan, so they didn't want it to be absolutely rock hard. But they also wanted to give both of these vehicles very sporty vibes, and that's certainly what we see here. At 50 miles an hour, I measured 72.5 decibels in this cabin, making this just a hair louder than the Camry the last time I tested it. That's quite logical, of course, because we have wider tires in this model, and we have summer tires, which are not generally focused on delivering a really quiet ride. Unfortunately, I was not able to cabin noise test the Sonata N Line without the summer tires. I suspect it's going to be a little bit quieter out on the road. Remember that there are a number of different components to cabin noise. Wind noise is well controlled in here, but through the road noise mainly comes from the tires and the tire size, tire compound that's been chosen. Over a week of mixed driving, fuel economy has been surprisingly good. Interestingly enough, the Camry, the Accord, and this Sonata have all gone above their EPA numbers in my testing. In this model, over a week of mixed driving, I've been averaging 29 miles per gallon, which barely edges out the Accord and the Camry. Now that all the scores are out of the way, let's go in for a deeper dive. I really like this new 8-speed dual-clutch transmission. Hyundai has done an excellent job at refining the slow-and-go and stop-and-go nature of this transmission. If I just stop and then let my foot off the brake pedal, we get creep that feels very much like a traditional 8-speed automatic transmission. Now, there are times where it can feel just a little bit DCT or manual transmission-y. Remember that at its heart, this is an 8-speed manual transmission. In fact, it's really two different manual transmissions that are being shifted by robot. If you want to know more about DCTs, there's some great articles out there, but the key thing to know is that there are times where this will feel like a manual transmission because basically at its heart, it is. But thanks to this new design that employs wet clutches rather than dry clutches, this is significantly smoother. And this feels an awful lot like the dual clutch transmissions that we find in modern Volkswagen and Audi products because they also use wet dual clutches now. The big benefit to a dual clutch transmission like this is the speed with which they can shift, because it's shifting actually from transmission A to transmission B. So when transmission A is in second gear, transmission B is already in third gear, and all it has to do is flop the clutches back and forth. That's one of the reasons that this is so responsive, whether we're shifting up or shifting down, either with the paddles or whether you just have it in drive. And speaking of just having this vehicle in drive, there are times where these shifts can come across as a little bit harsh. So for instance, if I were to stop here, I'm in the Sport Plus mode. If I accelerate, there is an awful lot of spin there, and then some really harsh transmission engagements as you go. There is so much power and so much torque coming out of this engine that I'm coming along to the one big downside to this vehicle, and honestly the Camry and the Accord as well, but to a lesser degree, and that's the fact that we don't have all-wheel drive. It's difficult for this vehicle to apply all this power and all this torque. There is a lot of wheel spin. Wheel hop and torque steer are very, very well controlled, to be perfectly honest, but it definitely still happens. And if you're out on your favorite winding mountain road like this, you really have to be careful with the throttle, because if you stab it a little bit too much, you just get so much front wheel spin that you start heading for the outside of the corner. Now that does make this an absolute hoot and a half to drive, but on the other hand, if you wanted better 0 to 60 times and honestly improved handling as well, especially in slightly slippery conditions, you really want all-wheel drive. Obviously, adding all-wheel drive would have added weight, it would have added complexity. That's one of the reasons that the Subaru Legacy is significantly slower than this, is its all-wheel drive system. It also has to do with the CVT as well, but the all-wheel drive is definitely a factor. But still, I wish it had all-wheel drive. Now, logically, if you wanted all-wheel drive in your mid-size sedan produced by the Hyundai Group, you could get something like the Genesis G80. It would be all-wheel drive. It's going to be a lot more expensive than this. Or you could get something like the Kia Stinger, which isn't going to have as big of a back seat. It's going to be rear-wheel drive biased. It's also going to give you all-wheel drive. But oddly enough, that Stinger is not going to be as fast 0 to 60 as this, unless you opt for the much more expensive twin-turbo V6. This is definitely faster than the 2-liter turbo that we find in the Stinger. When you put the Sonata N Line in the Sport Plus mode, it really holds those higher gears longer, and the shifts are also a little bit quicker. Again, some of those shifts can be harsh, but this transmission does a really good job of predicting which gear you might want. If you're braking, it'll downshift for you. It holds those gears a little bit longer, and the directness of the DCT has a really great feel to it. Now at those higher revs, you'll start to notice that the engine does not sound as refined as the V6 that we find in the Camry. And that's one of the things that I really love about the Camry V6, is its exhaust note. It has a great V6 engine sound. I think that the TRD exhaust is a little too drony for my tastes, but the rest of the trims of Camry V6 have a really great sound to them. The 8-speed automatic transmission is also going to be smoother, so don't get me wrong, this 8-speed DCT is lovely, but it's not going to be as smooth as that 8-speed transmission that we find in the Camry. So if you do a lot of stop and go or a lot of slow and go driving, you might want to get something with a traditional automatic. I've had a lot of questions about another video that you may have seen out there about the Sonata N Line falling behind some of the competition in acceleration runs. Honestly, I cannot explain it. In our testing, the Accord was definitely slower than the Sonata N Line. However, I will be getting my hands on an Accord 2.0T for 2021, the slightly refreshed Accord, so be sure and stay tuned for that video, and hopefully I'll be able to clear that up a little bit later. Now, that said, traction is certainly an issue for the Sonata N Line, and I recently got my hands on the Kia K5 GT, which is the Kia version of the Sonata N Line, and that model does not come with summer tires from the factory. And here's a hint, it is slower than the Sonata N Line because of the massive amount of wheel spin that you get in that model. Getting a little ahead of myself, that one ran 0 to 60 in 5.6 seconds with launch control. So tires and traction will definitely make a huge difference here. With that out of the way, let's dive into the pricing. The Sonata N Line is going to start at $33,300. And one thing that struck me as odd about the Sonata N Line pricing is that you can't get all the top-end features in the N Line that you can in the non-N Line version of the Sonata. So for instance, no heads-up display, no smart park, ventilated seats, heated steering wheel, power passenger seat, memory seat for the driver, 360-degree camera, or rear parking sensors. And it's worth noting that a lot of those options are available on the competition. With that out of the way, let's dive into the first competitor, which has to be the Camry V6. The Camry V6 is available in several different flavors. The TRD version of the Camry V6 is the least expensive at $32,185. In many ways, this is the more direct competitor to the Sonata N Line than the Camry XSE, because we see a similar number of changes versus the regular versions of the Camry for the Camry TRD. In addition to visual changes, there are some suspension changes, there's also an exhaust change, etc. It's much more of a complete performance package than we find in the Accord 2.0, or obviously in something like the Altima or the Subaru Legacy or any of the other options out there with higher horsepower engines. On the other hand, Toyota does delete a few things out of that TRD model that make me scratch my head as well. For instance, it has single-zone automatic climate control, and most of the Camrys out there will have dual-zone automatic climate control. It also has a smaller infotainment screen, a 7-inch screen, rather than the larger screens that we find in the rest of the Camry lineup. Now, when it comes to performance figures, as long as you can get a good hookup on the front tires, the Sonata N Line is going to beat the Camry pretty much every time. But if you're interested in a traditional automatic transmission or a V6 engine, then obviously the Camry is the right vehicle for you. And there are some logical reasons to go that direction. If, for instance, you don't like the idea of a turbo long-term, Camry is going to be a good option. And if you do a lot of stop and go or slow and go driving, a lot of in-city driving, then the 8-speed automatic transmission in the Camry is going to be a lot smoother. Next up, we have the Honda Accord with the 2-liter turbo. Be sure and stay tuned because I am going to be revisiting the Accord 2.0T over the next few months, so be sure and stay tuned for that. The Accord comes in two flavors with the 2-liter turbo, the Sport model at $30,590 and then the Touring model at nearly $37,000. You can sort of think of the Sport trim as the inexpensive alternative to the Camry TRD or the Sonata N Line, but it's not as modified as either of those vehicles. You definitely see more modifications to the Camry V6 in the TRD form than we see in the Accord versus the Accord Sport 2.0. Turbo lag is definitely more noticeable in the Accord 2-liter turbo, and it doesn't have as much horsepower as we find out of the 2.5-liter turbo in the Sonata N Line, but the Accord does very, very well for itself because of the really aggressive gear ratios and that 10-speed automatic. Personally, I prefer the exterior and interior design of the Accord a little bit more than the Camry, but I think that I like the interior design in the Sonata a little bit better than the Accord. Next up, we have the Sonata N Line's kissing cousin, and this is really an interesting twist here. The Kia K5 GT has the same engine and transmission, same basic suspension design, etc., although they're tuned ever so slightly differently. The two vehicles feel a lot alike out on the road. But the K5 is going to be less expensive at $30,590. That's because the K5 GT comes in two different forms. Base form for that $30,590, or there is one option package which adds a whopping $4,100, but it brings a ton of equipment that you cannot get on the base GT or on the Sonata N Line, oddly enough. So projector headlights, the power passenger seat, ventilated seats, heated steering wheel, fog lights, driver's seat memory, parking sensors, all that sort of thing you can get on the Kia version of this, but not on the Hyundai. Now on the downside, there's no full LCD instrument cluster available in the K5 at all, regardless of price. You will have to give up the heads-up display that's not offered in the K5 for some reason either, and oddly enough, neither is real leather. But the big difference you'll notice between these two vehicles if you're driving them back-to-back from dealer lots is that the dealer's probably going to try and show you the Sonata N Line with summer tires on it, and there is no summer tire package from the factory on the K5 GT. And this is a perfect example of the difference that tires can make. The 0 to 60 difference between the Sonata N Line and the Kia K5 GT, which I had just 1 week apart and tested on exactly the same road surfaces at almost exactly the same outdoor temperature, was nearly a half second. And that's because the K5 GT spins its tires in first, second, and part of third. Traction is a major issue, and if you can't apply the power, you're not going to get 0 to 60 as fast as a vehicle that perhaps had a little bit less power but didn't have the same problem hooking up. You'll definitely notice a big difference between the K5 GT and the Sonata N Line and something like the Camry V6 and the Accord 2.0T, because there's certainly a lot of wheel slip going on in the Camry and in the Accord, but not nearly the same level of wheel slip when we're talking about the models with all-season tires as we see in the Kia and the Hyundai. There's just so much torque and such an aggressive starting ratio that the front wheels are so easily overwhelmed. When it comes to 0 to 60 times, the only competitor that comes close to this group is the Chevy Malibu. With the 2-liter turbo in Premier trim, it'll set you back $34,295, and it will go 0 to 60 just about as fast as the Camry or the Accord. Unfortunately, the Malibu is not going to be with us for terribly long. There are a lot of rumors that it may be canceled this year or next year, but one way or the other, the Malibu is not going to live on for very long. So if you're interested in the Malibu, if you're looking for something in this segment and you want a little bit more room on the inside, because the Malibu is quite long, then you might want to take a look at the Chevy. The Chevy has a good handling feel out on the road, but it's not quite as engaging as the Camry TRD or the Accord Sport, or of course the Sonata or the Kia. And that's because the top-end version of the Malibu with the 2-liter turbo is not a sporty tuned version of the Malibu. It's the more luxurious version of the Malibu. But something that is more like the Sonata N Line and is priced very similarly would be the Kia Stinger. This is quite an interesting option because it is a little bit smaller than the Sonata or the K5, but still technically a mid-size sedan. The big thing is that it's rear-wheel drive, not front-wheel drive. It's also a liftback, so while you trade a little bit of legroom and passenger room, especially in the back seat, you do get a much larger cargo area, nearly double the cargo area that we see in either the Sonata or in the K5. The base 2-liter turbo engine is going to set you back $33,090, so right around the same price as the Sonata N Line, but you're going to get a 2-liter turbo with a little bit less power and rear-wheel drive. Now, it's not going to get you 0 to 60 as fast. 0 to 60 times are going to be around 6 seconds to 6.1 seconds, but the trade-off is much improved driving dynamics. The Stinger is an awful lot of fun out on your favorite winding mountain road, and really nothing will substitute the dynamics of a rear-wheel drive vehicle. Even grippy summer tires on the Sonata N Line aren't going to make it as much fun as you see in the Kia. Now, if you wanted to spend even more cash, you could get the Kia with the 3.3-liter twin-turbo engine and or all-wheel drive if that's something that you're interested in, features that are not available in the Sonata N Line. But they're obviously going to cost you more. And again, the Stinger is not going to be quite as big on the inside. It's also not going to feel quite as fresh. Next year, we're going to see a refresh of the Stinger, it looks like, in the United States, but at the moment, the interior and the infotainment system feels a little bit dated compared to what we see in the new Sonata. And that's where the competition really ends, because the Ford Fusion is dead, the Mazda 6, the Altima, and the Legacy may give you more oomph in their upper-end packages, but they're just not the same thing as the Sonata N Line. Let me know what you would choose if you were shopping in this segment down there. I actually see some really great reasons to buy all 4 of these main options. The K5 GT, you can get some of the features that you don't see in the Sonata N Line, and you could also swap in summer tires aftermarket if you wanted to. That's a very, very easy fix. The Camry V6 has a very pleasing exhaust note, very linear acceleration thanks to its naturally aspirated engine, high predicted reliability, and of course a traditional automatic transmission as well. And I think that the Accord splits the difference between some of these options, being a little bit softer than the Sonata N Line, a little bit more livable in that way, but still having excellent acceleration from its 2-liter turbo, and of course that lovely 10-speed automatic transmission. On the downside, deals are much thinner on the Honda dealer lot, so you're more likely to spend more on your Accord 2.0T than pretty much any of the other options that I've been talking about. I suspect that if my money were on the line, I might get a K5 GT, just because it offers some of those features that we don't see in the Sonata N Line, but I have to say that I like some of the things about the Sonata N Line's interior a bit more than the interior in the Kia K5. Let me know what you think about all that down there in the comment section below, and what would you get if you were shopping for something in this particular group? Would you go sideways and get something like that rear-wheel drive Stinger? In the meantime, be sure and head over to AOAmerch.com so you can find shirts right like the one that I'm wearing here. You can also head over to Instagram, Facebook, all those other social places, and I'll see all of you next week.